Hello, and welcome to our third webinar for parents. We looked at the things that are unfolding really currently for us and realized that we're taking a kind of a new big step here in Oregon, and that's that on May 1st, Kate Brown came out with guidelines about how Oregon will begin to phase in opening of businesses and additional services. So there are some very cautious guidelines that we're looking at, but the other part of this is that you'll have to make some of your own guidelines within those in terms of the decision you make about yourself and your child. We know that it'll be county by county based on new diagnoses and whether or not the curve is pretty flat in the locations that want to open. And so it's going to be spotty. It'll be bumpy, but in a lot of ways, this is probably good because we'll have small test areas where we can really see what kinds of things work. So that part is kind of a new part that we're facing now. And this is going to really impact families in a couple of ways. One is that it means that if you have a school-age child and you have to go back to work, it may mean that now your school-age child is going to be alone, or that you're going to have to figure out some other arrangements. A related issue is that also then that means you'll have higher exposure because you'll be out and going to work. And so it also means that more time will go to sanitizing and more time will go to, cleaning up the car and the things that you need to do to make sure that you're not bringing the disease into the house, laundry, showering when you get home from work, all that sort of thing. So that's one thing that'll make a difference for you. But the other one is that with preschoolers, daycares are going to be open, but then there's this question of at what risk. One thing is that many of the daycares that have been open were only serving people who were essential services, which would mean that those children were in families where someone worked in a position that exposed them more to COVID than the rest of us who were able to be more at home. So as parents are going back to work, more daycare centers will open and summer camps. They're talking also about summer camps and summer programs that are going to be opening up, but they'll be very phased. And nothing will be happening quickly and nothing will be happening all at once. But there are questions, I'm sure, now that parents are going to have. How do I know whether my daycare is really rigorous about sanitizing and looking after my child's safety? And so now there comes to this place of being greater trust than we've ever needed to have in terms of where we leave our children and daycares and our caregivers. So there's bound to be suspicion or skepticism, or maybe not suspicion, but concern, certainly concern, and anxiety and maybe fear. But we also have to remember we're not helpless here. So, there are lots of questions. We had some parents that asked questions like, does my child need to wear a mask? And if so, who provides that mask? And will my daycare provider be wearing a mask? And according to the guidelines, it appears that daycare providers will need to be wearing a mask. But what about other people that might be in that daycare? If it's a daycare home, does everybody in the home have to wear a mask? So on. So, there are questions that you'll need to ask the daycare providers. Some of them will be in the guidelines, but some of them will be questions that you might have that the guidelines don't address. Another thing that parents were asking was, will I be safer to take my child to the grandparents' house or find someone in the neighborhood who's willing to care for my child, even if it's not a licensed daycare home? And one part about that is I can't give any advice on that because I don't even know what the law says about that, much less what any of the guidelines say about that now that we're dealing with COVID. But if it is allowed for you to find a neighborhood home, and I assume it would be allowed for you to have your child with a grandparent, given that's a family member, but I don't know that. But if there's a place that you can leave the child that isn't a daycare center, you still would want to look at who all comes and goes from that house and where do those adults go. It might be that there's someone who goes to work and they go every day, but they're in a really very controlled environment and a very isolated environment compared to people who are coming and going who have a lot of exposure and much more contact with people, even though they may be wearing masks and doing protective measures. So those are, you need to ask those questions and look at what are your standards about this. One of the questions was, what about kids whose parents are first responders or medical staff? Will those kids be in the daycare that my child will be in? And I don't know that. Those are all questions that you want to start by asking your daycare provider. I know that there was a draft on May 1. I would assume that there are going to be, more guidelines that will follow, and that there will also very likely be some changes in either the plans or the timelines if there are surges of more COVID cases in any given locale. And that could happen if we had 4 or 5 or 6 counties that were able to begin opening. It might be that only one would end up having to move backwards and close more down again before they could open. So as long as this is done in many phases and stages and carefully and cautiously, we wouldn't necessarily have something where the whole state needed to close down again. It might be very local because there is much talk about tracing now and finding the people who have been exposed when someone is diagnosed. So that does change the game to a degree. So I want you to think back and remember about one of the messages from the earlier webinars, and that's about how we have less stress if we're able to be more flexible. So that one could be really a key thing here. Going into this reopening, knowing that, some things will change and timelines will change and all of that. And also that we have less stress if we can feel a sense of control, and we have a greater sense of control when we feel confident about our decisions. And so it's worth taking a little bit of time to get a little analytical here and maybe do some data. So get out a paper and pen, draw the line down the middle, write down the things that you can control and the things that you cannot control. So while on the side that says I cannot control the contagion rate, I can control some parts of how I expose myself to that. So whether or not I wear a mask and whether I wash my hands and whether I ask a lot of questions of the daycare providers. So making choices about where your child stays, that's one of the things that you do have some control over. Another analysis is looking at in the daycare providers' places that you're looking at, are there other people who are doing things like fixing food? And does that come in? Do we know whether the people who are doing things that come in as a part of the services to that daycare, how are those people looking to sanitizing and safety standards? So don't be hesitant to ask the questions that you have. This isn't a time to be, bashful or hesitant or feeling embarrassed about the questions we have. We're going to learn about how we're going to get through this together. So you just ask all the questions you need to ask. One of the questions I would have is whether or not parents who are dropping kids off at the daycare center are wearing masks as they come and go. And like I mentioned, who prepares the food, whether or not the daycare center or the person that will be caring for your child does sanitizing maybe throughout the day. I noticed that the gym that I belong to, which isn't open yet, is talking about opening, and the way they're going to do it is you sign up for an hour, and that there's a half-hour break between each hour session when they sanitize all the equipment, and then they open again for an hour, and then the staff sanitizes. So that would be a question: is that happening during the day as kids come and go? Another thing I would think that's just something to think about, and that's that when you're going to have a high-stress conversation with the provider or the person who might care for your child, think about having stressful conversations out of earshot from your child. One thing that happens is you're on the phone with someone and you ask a question and you're on edge, and your child picks that up. Your child doesn't hear the answer that the other person is saying, and so you may feel like, oh, all right, that's going to work. But you're not communicating that to your child who's just overhearing this. You're in this conversation with the provider. And one of the things we want is for children to feel confident. Once you make a decision, we want to have the most cautious optimism we can have heading into those kinds of situations. So it's not going to help your child to be anxious all day. So try to have conversations that you think may have a hint of anxiety in your voice, in a place that's where your children aren't going to pick up what that conversation is about. We always need to be honest with our children, but remember that developmentally, that doesn't mean that children have to know everything. It means that they need to know honest answers to whatever it is that's appropriate for them to hear. There's a family that I really admire in terms of how they are, bringing their children through this time, and they have a little boy that's I think he's an old 3-year-old, probably will turn 4 here pretty soon. And they've decided not to use the word virus when they talk about it. So I think that those are absolutely acceptable. Those are wonderful choices for people to be very conscious and thoughtful about what do your kids need to know. And really what they need to know is that you're doing the very best job you can in protecting them and keeping them safe and keeping you safe, and that, there are no guarantees. My mother always used to say, when I complained, she'd say, nobody ever said the world was going to be fair. And I think that's an honest viewpoint as well. So be honest with your kids, but recognize that young kids don't need a lot of information beyond the things they need to know to do and wash their hands and all of that. And that adults are taking care of them, looking out for them. It's going to be kind of a bumpy journey. We still have a long way to go. So it's also really important for parents to be thinking about, self-care for you is absolutely as important as taking care of your child, because children can only do as well as the adults around them. So one of the things sometimes I think we tend to do is, if we can only afford something, like if we needed counseling and our kid needs counseling, we get it for the kid because we want them to be well, when in reality, if we get it for the adult, then both people get better, the adults and the kids. So kids will do as well as you do. Take really good care of yourself. Give other people the room to feel differently about this than you do. It only adds to our stress if we feel like we have to convince someone else to feel just as urgently as we do about whatever your issue is. But that doesn't mean your issue isn't totally valid. It's just stressful if you put unnecessary energy into really wanting to convince someone else to feel the same way you do. So give people room. Recognize that with whatever their understanding is and whatever they brought to the table when they came to the pandemic, they're just doing the best they can, just like you're doing the best you can. Just like I'm doing the best I can. So take a deep breath and just keep moving. Be deliberate. Be cautious. Be cautiously optimistic. Find joy where you can and take each day just one step at a time. Thanks for joining.